But I think some of the things that I think are interesting about that is that his aversion to a single president as president. That strikes me as in some ways, the most striking thing. He wanted a sort of a triumvirate, as it were, a threesome, a bit like the Roman notion that you have a balance within that executive power, because the real fear was one individual, just one person, treating the rest of the country and the rest of his citizens as if they were just the objects of his whims and feelings. And
now, how relevant is that question today?
Well, exactly. This is why Franklin is such an interesting prism to look at today, because, yes, the one thing you can say that's currently the case in all the confusion is that all that matters is his whims and feelings on a day-to-day basis. When one thinks of, for example, Franklin's idea of what a republic would be, the idea that a president could raise tariffs, change them, abolish them, increase them, decrease them, at will, generating chaos across the entire global economy, would have appalled him. And the obvious reason, first of all, the Senate, he has no right to do that. The Senate has the right to do it. But the point is that there's a problem when one person is this powerful.
One of the things that the founders did was, through their knowledge of science and Newtonian balance, they loved the notion of checks and balances. And you see that in Franklin wanting not even to have a strong unitary executive, but how each of the branches has ways to check the other branches. And this is a great test we're about to go through now, which is the arbitrary wielding of power by a president, was something that the founders were most frightened of.
Yes, this is first of all, they would recognize this instantly, right? Would they not?
Sure, and you have to remember, of all the wonderful things Washington does, and does win the revolution, is after 2 terms, he goes back. He's Cincinnatus. He picks up his plow again and goes back to Virginia. That notion, John Adams was sort of on the other side. He wanted a more monarchy-like president, one who could serve for life.
That's fascinating. For life, that's a big deal.
Yeah, I'm not a scholar of John Adams. I can't quite figure out why he was such a monarchist when he had been such a rebel. But in the end, Adams doesn't win. We end up with a very clear system of Congress being the very first branch of government in the Constitution, and with the courts having a right to check executive power.
Yeah. Well, that doesn't quite emerge until a little bit later, but it's implicit, I think, at that point.
Well, I mean, certainly, and the cases in which Chief Justice Marshall and others established that are based in what the founders and what you can read in the Federalist Papers of the role of courts being co-equal with the other 2 branches.
And they're resting on Montesquieu, who's one of the sort of intellectual architects of the idea of separation of powers, and Locke, of course, with property rights, and obviously the English compromise between localities and central power, which emerged over a long period of time and was enabled in large part by the lack of a standing army by the British monarchy, which meant it was relatively very weak with respect to the other people in the society.
That's a couple of things we have to unpack from what you said. One is a standing army, meaning that the president can use the military against the American people, which is generally not accepted, the posse comitatus rule. The other thing you mentioned is Locke's version of property. And as you know, the way Locke has it in the second treatise is similar to that great second sentence of the Declaration. But he talks about life, liberty, and property as being the safeguards. And that the right to have property is what guards against arbitrary authority. And at that time, there was a concept in England called the Commons. And, we even have it with the Boston Commons when they come here today. But the Commons is called that because it's a common ground upon which everybody can graze their cattle. And that's where the word commoners come from, which is the commoners, the people who didn't have their own property, but they grazed on the commons. But around that time, you also have enclosure laws where you're allowed to fence off part of the commons and make it private property. Locke has this wonderful proviso that I'm dealing with in this book I'm writing now called "As long as they are well enough and good enough for others." In other words, you can have private property, but you have to leave certain things in the commons. Otherwise, people don't all have a stake in protecting us against arbitrary power. And I think we're seeing that play out today.